So Susan, if I can turn it over to you, and if you could do a little introduction and then
Sure.
get started with us, that'd be great.
Sure. Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Are we good? Thumbs up? Great, thank you. My name is Susan Chulgish, and I'm an organizational psychologist. The first part of my career, I spent my time in Fortune 50 companies, and then took a break from that and for a few years, and um, really rethought my work. And for the last almost 20 years, I have been an organizational psychologist with my whole focus on our church in the United States. And so I consult with churches and denominational leaders of all denominations across the country. As Kip said, uh, I work a lot with the Holy Cow tools, such as the CAT questionnaire. Um, in my almost 20 years, I've probably interpreted over 500 of these reports, and used them in my own consulting with churches. Just a little bit more about the history of Holy Cow. Uh, it was founded about 30 years ago by a gentleman named Russ Crabtree. And Russ had been, his first career was as a research engineer for Kodak. And then he felt the call to ministry, and he was a Presbyterian minister in Ohio for 20 years, and then began working with the presbytery, and then decided to put his engineering mind and his ministerial mind together to try to find ways to help congregations better understand themselves, have data that they needed to make better decisions, and to create more vitality in the church. And from there, his tools have gone nationwide, and your presbytery picked up on the use of the tool, and here we are. What you have in front of you is about a 6-page executive summary of the full report. And as Kip was telling you, the full report is well over 100 pages of data. And what I have tried to do in this executive summary is provide a narrative overview of the salient findings. And what I'm going to do, since you have it in your hand, I'm going to also put it up on the screen, and I'm going to walk us through that. I'm certainly not going to read it to you, but I'm going to explain the pieces of data and how they connect. And I've also created 2 graphics of key data about the congregation's climate and culture that not only I'll explain that to you, but then also show the similarities and differences among your age groups and among your 2 different services. And again, I'll try to keep this time frame tight so that you have as much time as possible to ask questions when I've gone through the report. Just want to remind you of what this instrument measures. It measures the experiences, the perceptions, and the aspirations of the members of the congregation. And that's what's represented here in your summary report, what the numbers tell us about member experience, perceptions, and aspirations. So I'm going to share the report. Hopefully you can go through it with me, and you can see it better by having your hard copy in front of you. First, I want to just thank you all for the level of participation in this exercise. You had really good participation. 177 of you responded. That is a whopping 151% of your recent average Sunday attendance. Participation rate is measured against average Sunday attendance, and you provided Holy Cow Consulting what that is. Based on your pre-COVID average Sunday attendance, this 177 who participate represent 79% of your average Sunday attendance. Again, excellent. This instrument is designed and is very sensitive so that we only need to achieve a 33% participation rate for the data to be valid and reliable and representative of the whole. So you more than achieve that. So we're really comfortable with this being valid and reliable data. As was mentioned earlier, there are a number of places through the lengthy report. I'll point out some of those in this executive summary, where your response profiles are compared to the last 250 or so churches who've taken the CAT during COVID. So we're trying to compare apples to apples here. In the actual database of churches who have taken the CAT, you can imagine over the last 30 years that there's thousands of them. But because of this unique time of COVID, the comparison is with churches who have gone through the similar circumstances and challenges that you have. The first thing I'd like to draw your attention to are what are called indices that the CAT measures. There are 10 of them. 2 are called descriptive of the culture. We're going to look at those later. 8 of them are called performance indices, and they are listed here in bullet point: hospitality, morale, conflict management, governance, spiritual vitality, readiness for ministry, engagement in education, and worship and music. And in the CAT instrument itself, there were between 3 and 6 questions that measured each one of these indices, and how you responded to them provide a profile of the congregation's experiences and perceptions about these various areas of congregational life. I want to say up front that of these 8, if we just look at your data, the congregation showed a positive experience or perception of all 8 of these. When comparing, while comparing these 8 to the 250 congregations, there were a number of them that did not compare as favorably. So you could say that in the eyes of your congregation, we're doing pretty well here. Compared to other congregations, there's room for improvement in some areas. So let's take a look at those. The first area is hospitality, which measures the degree to which people experience an openness, a desire to create an environment where people feel welcome, people who are new, people who are different, people who are in need. And there are questions from, being a part of this church community has given new meaning to my life, to I sense an atmosphere of genuine care and concern. Across all of the questions, this congregation, you all responded very positively. Compared to other congregations, you would see room for improvement. While you responded positively to all the questions about hospitality, on that scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree, not a large percentage strongly agreed to all these aspects about hospitality. And therefore, your level, if you will, of enthusiasm or positivity just wasn't as strong as other churches. That does not mean, though, that you don't see this as a strength for your church in and of yourselves. Let's look at the next index, which is called morale. It measures, if you will, the persuasive or passionate force of engagement members have in the mission of the church. Your results demonstrate that members are on the fence. The way they answered the questions on the 6-point answering scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree, the majority of the congregation landed in the middle or on the fence. So they were either, holding a wait and see. I'll let you know really how I feel in terms of morale. When we have a new pastor, or there are just some things that they are more positive about and some things they're not as positive about in the life of the congregation. I find this typical in congregations that are in a clergy transition. There's just not a commitment to this strong sense of morale, probably because in a clergy transition, the congregation's kind of general sense of anxiety is a little harder because you're in a transition. The next index that's measured is conflict management, and that measures the degree to which members believe that conflict is appropriately managed and, where possible, resolved. What we discovered, and I think is worthy of conversation in your congregation, is that about a third of the people responding perceived a disturbing amount of conflict. The question that was asked was, there's a disturbing amount of conflict in our congregation, and about 36% agreed to that statement. Now, given that, however, the other questions the responses are more positive. Folks said that we do usually solve problems through mutual efforts, that there is a healthy tolerance of differences of opinion. So that is good. I think what's worth conversation here is, how do we understand this conflict that people are either experiencing or perceiving? Is it some residual from COVID or before COVID? Is there something actively where you're at odds with one another happening right now? So this is critical because conflict, when not understood and not addressed, can then is one of the key factors of then coloring the whole experience of the congregation for its members. Let's look at the next index, which is entitled Governance. And this is really a series of questions about trust in the formal leaders of the congregation, and whether members believe that the decision-making processes are open to their concerns and that they have input in the decision-making processes. And much like hospitality, all of the responses across the questions around governance were answered in the positive. Compared to other congregations, your responses were typical or average, again, because people weren't emphatically positive. There weren't as many strongly agrees around the work of your governance, but there were strong agrees, just not strongly agree, but a lot of agrees, which shows that you have confidence and trust in your leaders. Usually, when I see the answers to the questions where a smaller percentage of people are strongly agreeing instead of what you'd hope would be a larger percentage. I think that's also due to a clergy transition. People are a little more anxious. They're hoping that their governance leaders will lead the congregation through the transition well and to the appropriate call of the next pastor. So I sense that the way that you all answer these questions is reflective again of your transition time. The next index that's measured is entitled Spiritual Vitality. And this measures the degree to which members believe that their faith is central to their lives. The questions in this index were all worded in the first person. So it wasn't a reflection on what you see as the spiritual vitality of the entire congregation, but your own individual senses of spiritual vitality. And for your congregation, this is strong. This is high. There was a high level of agreement across all the questions that measure this index. Just some of the questions, there was again the kind of pattern you've shown, not a high percentage strongly agreeing about their experience of God and spirituality in their lives, but still the majority agreeing. So this is a strength in the congregation, coupled with another statistic based on a question that asked about your commitment in your own daily lives, at home, away from church, to daily devotional prayer. And that's very strong as well. What's interesting about the Spiritual Vitality Index and how you responded to the questions is that it's the only measure in the CAT that is directly correlated to stewardship, to financial giving to the church. And in your results, there were two questions that you answered about money. One was asking you to report your average annual household income. And the other question was asking you to report in dollars your stewardship giving to the church annually. And when the data is analyzed, the number that most connects to spiritual vitality is the average percent of household income given to the church. And as you can see in the report, yours is 2.59 or 2.6%, which is above the average for PCUSA, which is at 1.9%. And so your strong responses to the spiritual vitality question they do in fact correlate to what we would expect higher percentage of giving than in other churches, and that's true for you, and that's wonderful. The other thing that was learned is that by looking at the household income, that there's some untapped potential in terms of future stewardship that might be able to improve the stewardship numbers for your church, which would then improve your ability to engage in your ministries. The next index that's measured is called Readiness for Ministry. What this measures, if you will, is how does the church and how do its members understand being baptized into Christ's ministry? It gets at how engaged is the church in ministry and its members, and is there a strong support for ministry and strong support for people who engage in the ministry? And once again, this is a strength. Um, it's typical of churches nationally. The strongest area in terms of the questions measuring this index, folks feel that the church provides appropriate opportunities for members to engage in ministry. Um, there's a little bit work to be done on a couple of questions. One is how the church helps members understand their call to ministry and how the church helps them discern their gifts and connects their gifts to ministries in the church. The next index, next to last here, is engagement in education. This measures actually two aspects of Christian education and formation. The first is motivational. Does the congregation understand a lifelong commitment to spiritual learning and formation? And that's very strong in your congregation. The other two questions are around your flexibility in providing the programming to meet people's busy lifestyles and just the general quality. And both of those are strong. That folks feel overall that you're trying to find ways to be flexible to provide this education and formation that fits their lifestyle, and quite strong in terms of the overall quality of the formation programming. And then the last performance index that this tool measures, worship and music. Now, the majority of the congregation experience music as outstanding in quality and appropriate in style, with 34% strongly agreeing about the music program, 32% agreeing, and 22% tending to agree. So there's 90% who are agreeing about the music program. The rest of the worship experience has a little bit more of a mixed review, and those are the aspects of presiding, preaching, the pace of the worship, the ease of participation, and, if you will, the panache or the aesthetics of the worship environment. Folks agreed that worship was exceptional, but it was kind of a lukewarm agreement. More people tended to agree than people who agreed or strongly agreed. So that aspect might be an area, not might, is an area for you to examine, because what we also learned is that worship is a top motivator or driver of member satisfaction. And so the better the worship experience, the better the satisfaction of it and the morale of its members. And because your top priority is growth, worship is a critical factor in growth. If the members are experiencing worship as an outstanding spiritual exercise, then newcomers will feel that too. If members are a little feeling mediocre about their worship, other people will pick up, new people will pick up on that. And so to grow, which is your top priority, means that these aspects of worship that you're saying could be improved, probably need to be looked at. This is one area for some, I think, important conversations, perhaps in your listening groups. Now I'm going to turn to two other indices. I mentioned them earlier. They're called descriptive of the culture when they're correlated. The first index is Theological Perspective. And, excuse me, in your answers to the questions about theological perspective, we learned that you are a more progressive, theologically progressive church. And while you are, there's a small percentage who are not as theologically progressive, but are more theologically conservative. And that can be a strength. If you are not engaged in any kind of conflict around theological perspective, this kind of breadth of holding that together under one roof and welcoming people with different faith journeys and theological understandings is a real strength in terms of your ability to grow and attract new members. The other descriptive index is called flexibility style. It registers the congregation's willingness and ability to adjust or experiment with new ways of doing ministry that meet the needs not only of the members, but meet the needs of the people you're trying to reach. And in this area, overall, you show some adaptiveness, which is really important for the future sustainability and growth of the congregation. I suppose the way you can think about this is a congregation is really like any other organization that has constituents. And so if a business fails to produce products that meet the needs and expectations of their customers, they're going to go out of business. And that is the way of the world right now with the church, that if the church isn't flexible enough to meet the needs of its members, and especially the needs of the people out in the community that they're trying to reach, then growth is very difficult. Growth is very difficult. What's interesting here is that there's some variability. Overall, the congregation shows adaptiveness, and I'm gonna put up a chart that I believe you also have in your packet that that will show us some of the uniqueness among groups. Hold on one second, and I will put this up. Thanks for your patience. So what we have here is called the descriptive map. Along the horizontal axis is the continuum of theologically progressive to theologically conservative. The vertical axis is the flexibility axis from settled to adaptable. And as you can see, if you have this in front of you, where the diamond is the overall summation of the data for the congregation. But but then you asked Holy Cow to do some breakdown by ages and by your traditional and nexus service. And so here's what we have, that the majority of the congregation fall into what's called the progressive adaptable quadrant. And this quadrant, congregations that fall into this quadrant are known as magi congregations. And I'll talk about that description in a minute. The nexus, those who attend the nexus service are in the progressive settled quadrant, and this is known as the Paraclete or Holy Spirit quadrant. Basically, what this is saying in general is that those who attend the Nexus service experience the congregation as much more settled or rigid about trying new things, about adapting to the needs of the community. That's how you can look at this in general. Um, and one other thing I want to show you while I have this up is that while you're somewhat adaptive and flexible in trying new things, and changing things up in how you do ministry or worship or other aspects of your life together. At the 90th percentile, we have hash marks, which I didn't show here on these axes, but I've placed a dotted line at the 90th percentile of flexibility. The only congregations that are growing across the country are above the 90th percentile in being adaptable. So, in other words, they are much more, they're just much more strategically flexible and adaptive and willing to try and experiment with new things in order to reach new people. And so there's some room for you to exercise more adaptability. And with the session on Sunday, we talked about ways in which to do that. So I'm going to go back to the report, and I just want to describe where the majority of the congregation falls in terms of being a magi, if you will, congregation. So, magi cultures, theologically progressive, somewhat adaptive. There's a rational, intellectual approach, more intellectual approach to faith and the journey of understanding and discovery. As I've stated here, magi communities at their best. And when I say at their best, that means when they're very mission centered and mission focused, and their lives revolve around their mission, and all of their ministry is related to that mission. So at their best, they exhibit deep knowledge, open discourse, intellectual curiosity. These churches that are magi are uniquely equipped to be the powerful voice and ally for those in need of advocacy. I see a lot of magi churches around the country who some of their primary ministries are involved in advocacy, social justice, all sorts of movements that are going on in their communities. It's common for folks in magi cultures to talk about issues from a more systemic perspective. What can happen, however, in magi cultures that lose their sense of mission, they are viewed or perceived as a group who just love to get into esoteric debates and do a lot of thinking, but not a lot of doing in ministry. and don't put proper weight on the role of emotion in faith, failing to realize that emotion is what leads to action. And so they can become frustrated that when they make decisions, those decisions don't bring about action or change. And so that's the culture piece. So learning you're somewhat adaptive, but that's an area of something to talk about, in an area for growth in terms of expanding your willingness to try new ways of ministry, perhaps trying new ideas in worship that will meet the people of the community where they are, that they would see you all as a place that they would like to be part of. The other aspect that I'd like to review with you quickly is the congregation's climate. Two questions, when correlated, give us that climate. It's member satisfaction, their sense of well-being, and member energy. And what I'd like to do again is to show you there's another chart in your packet that I'd like to review with you quickly and walk you through that. It's called the Energy Satisfaction Map. And again, we have 5 quadrants. And as you can see, the majority of the congregation falls within the transitional quadrant and overlapping chaos quadrant. The age 55 to 64 are in the transformational quadrant. They just responded more positively to the question of how satisfied are they with the church, and do they see the church active and not just going through the motions. So this is your most positive group in the church, the 55 to 64. And the Nexus attendees are in what's called the recovery quadrant. They perceive the church as less willing to engage different aspects of ministry. They see the church a little bit more just going through the motions of church, and therefore their satisfaction is lower as well. I am going to go back to the report and just share with you some of the understanding of these quadrants where you are. So the majority of the congregation is in this overlap between the transition quadrant and the chaos quadrant. To be a transition church means that you have a number of strengths that you can lean into. A number of strengths as indicated of what we just reviewed in the performance indices. But there's some strategic work to do in some areas to which I spoke. But there's a kind of with those strengths, you can become a much more vital and growing congregation. However, because you're also in the chaos quadrant, there are a couple of things that you need to consider to really be able to move into more vitality. Chaos systems show abundance of more energy, force of engagement, but lack a sense of peace. In chaos churches, there are a number of distinct centers of activity. They're busy. And these are characterized by high subgroup loyalty to these activities, commitment, and these different areas of activity in the church have distinctive approach to how they do their work. However, there's not a strong alliance to a larger vision or mission, or a strong alliance to the governance system or the clergy leader. So what can happen is that all the energy is out of alignment with the central purpose of the church. And sometimes when somebody tries to negotiate and create an effort to restore alignment and bring all these activities back together under the umbrella of mission, conflict can certainly ensue, and that lowers satisfaction. Now, just a couple of more things, and I just, because I want to make sure there's some time for questions. We learned what are those things that drive your member satisfaction. So when they were answering the question of how satisfied they are, what were some of the things on their mind? Number one driver of satisfaction is the quality of the worship experience. Number two, that the governance leaders are representative of the whole, that they're in their deliberating, they are listening and open to the membership. And finally, the third driver of satisfaction, it, as it's worded here, is one of the questions in the hospitality index. So what's driving member satisfaction now is the worship experience, how the leaders govern, and hospitality. And again, not surprisingly, it's these same three factors that are key success factors to improving satisfaction. So if work is done in terms of worship, governance, and hospitality, members will even be more satisfied. And then finally, we have the top priorities. You were asked a question about your aspirations for the future and where you would want additional energy placed to achieve the vision for the future you want. And the first two are related to growth, attracting families and youth, and then just a general strategy about reaching new people. The third priority is one around pastoral care, developing ministries toward healing those broken by life circumstance. The fourth one, which I think is related to the impact of COVID, is the congregation wants more opportunities for people to form meaningful relationships, regathering in groups and fellowship, to reconnect with one another after COVID. The fifth priority is one that's externally focused, about renewing and revitalizing the community around the church by building partnerships. And then the sixth one is Christian education and spiritual formation. So the rest of the report is kind of a summation of what I just reviewed. So I'm looking at the clock. I want to honor your time, and I know I went through this quickly, but I would love to honor your questions.
Hi, thanks for speaking with us today. Still on page 5, back near the top when you were summarizing the drive to satisfaction and how we get there, I don't understand how hospitality is interpreted out of being part of the church community is giving me new meaning to my life.
That's one of the questions that measures hospitality. There are 5 questions that are in the hospitality index, and one is related to, do we welcome people from different walks of life? One is related to, is there a friendly atmosphere in the church? One is, do we show genuine concern? Another one is, are we prepared to welcome newcomers? And the fifth one is this one, that being a part of this community has brought new meaning to my life. And it's that question out of hospitality that was one of the strongest correlations to member satisfaction.
I have two questions.
Sure.
On page 5 again, it says that 4 of the 6 top priorities are shared across all age groups.
Mm-hmm.
Are you able to tell us the 2 priorities that were not shared across all age groups?
Sure. Hold on, I've got the full report in front of me here. The one that is shared by 2 age groups. I mean, there were 3 age group breakdowns. Under 35 years of age, 35 to 64, and then 65 and over. So the 4 that I listed there are shared by the whole congregation, or this, and the top 4. Now, there's one that's shared by 2 age groups, and that is to provide more opportunities for Christian education. And that is shared by the under 35 and the over 65. That wasn't of interest in the middle age group, which was interesting. What's unique to an age group is for the under 35s, which I found interesting because I've never seen this before. What's unique to the under 35 is to enlarge and improve the physical plant of the church to expand ministries. Usually I see that in the older age groups, but this is the young age group looking at wanting to improve the physical plant. And there's one that's unique to the middle age group, ages 35 to 64. And theirs is expand outreach ministries that provide direct service to those living on the margins. And so they're seeing the need for the church to move out more and more into the community to meet people's needs.
Okay, thank you. So number 6 was one of the priorities that just had 2 groups, and
Correct.
which other number was just 2 groups?
That was, let's see, 58. The other one was, it's one of the top priorities, develop ministries that work toward healing those broken by life circumstance. That one is in the middle age group and the over 65 age group. So that's,
Okay.
they're looking at the pastoral needs of the congregation. And that was not in the younger age group.
Thank you. And then I had one more question on page 3.
Sure.
It talks about how it's important because we want to grow. Growth is our top priority.
Mhm.
I was just curious, is that kind of a blanket thing that all churches' top priority is to grow, or is that something that we indicated to you that that was our top priority?
Well, you indicated it because when you ranked the priorities, the top 2 were to make necessary changes to attract families and children, and the second highest was to create opportunity to develop a comprehensive strategy to reach new people.
Okay.
And the whole congregation, those were the top 2. Now, to answer the other part of your question, yes, for the 30 years of this CAT tool, 96% of congregations have these as their top two priorities in one order or the other. You know, and what's interesting about your order is the top priority is make necessary changes to attract. And when I met with the session, I asked them to underline those three words, make necessary changes. And then, you know, when we got to that graphic I showed you about your adaptability, where there's room for growth, there's a little bit of a disconnect here in terms of where you are as a congregation in your comfort level, where you live in your gut, your comfort level for change and flexibility versus what you want. And you want to make changes to grow. And so there's a little bit of what I would call a spiritual dissonance there that I think you all have to grapple with. How serious are we about making changes to do the things that we hope will be in our future? Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
You bet.
I had a question about the questionnaire. When we got it, I think I assumed that the questionnaire was made just for us,
Mhm.
for our congregation, but I think I'm hearing from you that this is the same questionnaire that's been used with thousands of people. Is that accurate?
That's correct. There are 85 standard questions, and then you are able to customize it with additional questions. So it's a hybrid of what's used across the country, with some questions that you wanted to ask specifically. And the beauty of doing this is that you begin to understand not just yourself, but yourself in relationship to where, you know, the church is in general across the country.
Could you address the questions that referred to your past minister?
Oh,
I
sure.
think if a church has had the same minister for the past 20 or 30 years, most people don't even know who the past minister was. And that's not the case with our congregation.
So there are 10 questions in the CAT that refer to the former pastor, the most recent former pastor. Those are not designed to measure the performance of the former pastor. They're there to help you understand a particular characteristic of your congregation. Let's see if I can answer this easily. So, someone asked questions about the drivers, you know, the drivers of satisfaction. To achieve the understanding those drivers of satisfaction for your congregation, a statistical correlation is done. They take the satisfaction question and all the other questions in the CAT and do a correlation to see which questions in the CAT are most connected to satisfaction. Now, yours had nothing to do with pastor, but they could have. In some congregations, the drivers of satisfaction are all related to those questions about the pastor, which gives an understanding of a characteristic of the congregation called clergy centeredness. Now, in your case, you're not clergy centric because none of those questions connected with satisfaction for you. But those questions are there to help a church understand if they are clergy centric. Does that make sense? It just so happens you're not, and therefore they show up nowhere in this report. But if you know, for instance, I'm doing an interpretation tomorrow night for a church, a Presbyterian church in Florida. All of the drivers of satisfaction are those clergy questions. So they're very dependent upon their pastor to make everything happen and dependent upon their pastor for their satisfaction. You are the opposite. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Just one thing I want to add to that point about the former pastor questions is in the data that we have, the detailed data we have, we don't see those questions. So what's being said here by Susan is they use those questions to create these correlations and help us understand. But you can't dig through the data and see, how did the former pastor rank on this, that, or the other thing?
Right.
Those
And
questions aren't here.
right. And here's the rationale that Holy Cow has. They want you to understand the congregation. They never want this tool to be used as a performance hammer against clergy. If it became that, the tool would probably never be used for fear that it could be used in a negative way. This is meant to be used for learning, understanding, and growth. There are other ways to do performance conversations with clergy than a questionnaire like this that are healthier and more beneficial.
I was just wondering if this tool that we're speaking about will be used in the interviewing process to find our next minister.
Well, here's how I would invite you to think about it. So you have folks working on your mission study, and I think part of the work is how do they see being able to incorporate some of this learning into the mission study so that clergy candidates can read about it. And how can they use some of the language here about what they've learned at the PNC, what they've learned about the congregation, and how they speak to clergy candidates about the congregation. This gives them language. And they can also use this information to form interview questions with the candidates. For instance, you could say, here's an aspect that we've learned about ourselves. And that aspect is we desire growth, but how we operate as a culture, we're a little bit more comfortable we're not as flexible and adaptive to achieve growth as we wish we could be. Have you worked in a congregation like that? And if you have, how have you helped that congregation address that characteristic of itself? And what would you do to help us address that characteristic of ourselves? So you can take the data that's most meaningful to you, and you can then turn that data into questions to ask candidates. And then you are really going to have a good sense of the fit of that candidate for the needs you have in your church. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. But one other question though, do you use these tools with the ministers so we can cross-index and see where there's similarities?
No, there's not a specific tool that gives you a profile of a pastor candidate, unfortunately. However, I think the learning here is really important. If by you knowing yourselves this well, you will begin to clearly see the best fit for you. And rather than asking questions of candidates, have you done this? And these questions are yes or no. Um, how do you preach? Blah, blah, blah. I would suggest that you get to behavioral questions of how have you helped a church grow? Give us some examples. Where have you succeeded? Where have you failed? And what did you learn if you failed? How have you helped a congregation enliven its worship experience? What have been the pitfalls that you've experienced? Where have you achieved success? As you know, as you read our mission profile, mission study, and we've talked to you about who we are, how would you approach it with us? And I think through some of those behavior-based questions, you will quickly begin to see where the fit is and where it's not. And the pastor will begin to be able to discern whether he or she has the right gifts to be successful with you. Good question. Thank you.
If someone wants to pursue the pastor issue, I'll wait with my question. Okay. I'm uncomfortable the way that Nexus is portrayed in the quadrants. And I do not attend Nexus regularly. I have in the past 20 years. But I do not attend Nexus, but I am a friend of Nexus, definitely. It does not seem to me to be the Nexus that I know. I'll tell you that. I'm wondering whether the data that came out of people who identified themselves as being associated with Nexus happens to be their perceptions, not of themselves, but of traditional worship. That's why they happen to be in Nexus, not in traditional worship. Yet they're not answering about themselves as Nexus, but they are answering as they see traditional worship.
I think maybe I wasn't clear enough. In the energy satisfaction map, that represents their experience. They're not as satisfied with life in the church as the rest of the congregation. And they perceive the congregation going more through the motions rather than being really engaged in ministry. The descriptive map is what you said. It's their perception that they are as theologically progressive as the rest of the congregation, but it is their perception that the congregation is much less flexible about trying new experimenting with new things in the life of the church. That's what those two are saying. So it's not necessarily portraying who they are. It is showing to you that their experience of the church is different than the rest of the church. And their perceptions of the church are different. And so it isn't a negative reflection on them. It is that they are experiencing and seeing the church differently, and I think hoping for the church to be more flexible, more adaptive, and trying new things, and not going what they perceive as it going through the motions.
One thing I might interject here is that the survey is some information for us to learn and process about where we're headed. The listening sessions are us talking to each other about what our perceptions are and what we'd like to see differently. And it may be, this nexus question has come up on a number of occasions. We talked about this quite a bit on Sunday with the session and the mission study team, is we don't really understand it. So I think what we need to do is figure out a way, perhaps we have a couple nexus specific listening sessions so we can get the information. Because a lot of times in survey information, if you're really close to something and you hear the kind of information that comes out, you can't believe it. You don't understand it. But my experience has been there's something there. It may not, you may be overreacting to it, or it may not be totally clear, but there's usually something there. So I think as we move forward with the listening sessions, we can get more information and qualitative information, not just, filling in a bubble on the page. Am I more excited or medium excited or less excited? And this is all valuable for us, but it's really in our interactions as a congregation around these listening sessions and being open with each other. I mean, these are going to be small groups. There's going to be 8 people there with a couple facilitators, and just let's talk about it. And I think if we have some maybe specifically focus, that could be helpful. Yeah, John.
We have the data at the first paragraph that the respondents represented 151% of our most recent average attendance and 79% of pre-COVID attendance. Do we have a breakdown for Nexus alone? In other words, the average attendance at Nexus and how many respondents from Nexus out of that percentage? Do we have that? Do we have those data? Sorry,
We-
Kip, I'm going back to quantitative.
Yeah, we have, you cut this several ways. So we have those who exclusively attend Nexus. It was 11 participants, which is 9%. And then we have, if I can find it, those who attend mostly Nexus, but attend maybe both. That's another 18 people, which represents 15% of average Sunday attendance. And this data is all in that 100 pages of the full report that I imagine there could be a copy in the office made available for anybody who wants to come and look at it.
Okay, thank you for those. That helps some perspective because I have a sense of what the average weekly attendance at Nexus is, but I don't think that's in the report. So we have the numerator, we don't have the denominator, but we can get that, right, Kip?
We're either exclusively or mostly Nexus. So I think if you look at what the pre-COVID attendance was at Nexus, was maybe 50 on average, or maybe 50. What's the right number? So you got 30 people that filled out that they primarily go, and if we say 50, even 60, you're at 50% or so, and they say 33% is what's required to be statistically significant in terms of the information. Right. But I think we need to dig into it beyond the numbers, I think is a point. And not only with Nexus, but with all of it. Because there is a lot of other information that's embedded in this that we need to dig into and understand better as we look where we want to go in the future and what things are most important for us to be successful to the things that we aspire to. So it's really across the board. But we've been thinking about the listening sessions and how could we maybe segregate them in some ways to get at some of this information. For example, the one thing I'm not sure everybody caught on, but the 54 to 65 age group, is that right? 54
Yes.
to, yeah.
Yeah.
65 age group's the most excited in the church. Why is that? I'm 64, by the way. I turn 65 in 2 months. But I think it would be nice to uncover what's happening there.
Mhm.
And if we had a small group with that group too.
Yeah.
So that's something that we're still thinking about. If you have some ideas, you can email any of us or stop us and talk about it. But yeah, Betty.
Many of you are just at that point of retirement. And now you're seeing, you're seeing new horizons, the things that you can do. Yeah, so I think probably that age bracket into something that's.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Yeah.
Hi, and I want to thank you for your leadership in the data. It's very helpful to, I'm probably not in the picture, I'm way on the side there. So anyway, I'm 59, so I'm kind of excited about the church. And I've been around it and been wildly impatient at the same time. And I think that what I'm hearing in the data that we have is that we have a creative tension to hold.
Mhm.
That's a good thing.
Mhm.
That's a good thing. And the other part of this is what I've been saying to the committee, and that we have started to kind of dig into, is that we have the data now. It's not discernment. Data is not discernment.
Yeah.
This is the jumping off place
Mhm.
for our looking deeply at who we are and where we want to be and where God is calling us. So this gets us down into, some of the nitty gritty numbers. It also invites us to kind of hold that and also look big picture, right? And to look at our journeys as we take them individually and together, and to see what the desire is, because there is a deep desire here. That's what I've been hearing in this conversation, the desire. And that is the work of the Spirit. So.
That was a great closure, unless anybody has a question.
It was an excellent closure.
Oh, yes. My wife is reminding me to thank all of you for being here. And I think part of it was because you heard about the mac and cheese, but we'll take credit for the rest of it. So no, thank you very much for being here. And again, I mean, to Leslie's point, this is the beginning, not the end. So we hope that you'll continue to be engaged in this process as we go forward. And we very, very much want to hear from you. So yeah, for sure. And Susan.
Thank you all.
Oh yeah, signups. And Susan, thank you very much. I mean,
Oh,
you've
you're welcome.
been a real asset, and we'd like to reserve the right maybe to send you a question or two in the future as we go through this.
You can send me a question. You can call to converse. However I can be helpful to you in your next steps, I'm happy to do that.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much.